But remember, for months and months, uh, not just the Israeli populace, including Netanyahu's bitterest enemies, backed his agenda, but the United States did, and in
Yeah.
fact, many Western European countries and many countries otherwise that are kind of have favored uh, Israel's policy almost in a kind of carte blanche way.
Welcome back to The Focus. I'm Dr. John Bruni. Today we're joined by one of the world's leading voices on the ethics and evolution of modern warfare, Professor Samuel Moyn. A historian and legal scholar at Yale University, Samuel has written extensively on human rights, the laws of war, and the political consequences of military innovation. His book, Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War, asks a provocative question. Has our push to make war more ethical actually made it easier to fight and harder to end? From the battlefields of Ukraine to the conflict in Gaza and into the rapidly advancing world of autonomous weapons, Samuel challenges how we think about justice, technology, and the future of armed conflict. We'll examine whether humane war is a moral victory or a dangerous illusion. Samuel, welcome back to the Focus.
Thanks so much for having me again, John.
Sam, in our last conversation, you argued that making war humane often extends it. 2 years on with Ukraine and Gaza dominating headlines, have these wars confirmed your warning, or do they show that in some cases humanity in war is still a meaningful and actionable goal in an era where international norms are being challenged or simply ignored?
Well, a bit of both. So just to go back, I never would have said that it wasn't a worthy goal to make warfare more humane, as if we just should, let as much brutality as anyone ever wants to inflict take place. Rather, it's that we could do both things somehow, make sure to keep in sight our main goal, which is the control of force, the search for peace, even while giving subsidiary attention to how wars are being fought and not letting our our concern for that matter uh, like lead us to kind of cosmetic improvements to wars that then go on and on. So I think the the Ukraine war has challenged the framework in one self-evident way, which is that people got very angry at the start about Vladimir Putin's aggression. And that was new. And in fact, there were moves, including by leaders of great powers, to set up an aggression tribunal, something that hasn't happened since Nuremberg, unless you count some, amendments that the International Criminal Court hasn't really acted on yet. So, in a sense, that is progress. Now, it's selective progress because uh, in many of these discussions, it involved singling out Vladimir Putin as even as he, claimed the authority of what the United States and other great powers have been doing since the end of the Cold War, invading willy-nilly where they like, sometimes with Australian support. Okay, so that's a big change. I'd say in many ways it's a fascinating war from the perspective of our last conversation because though there were atrocity claims and real evidence of it around Bucha early in the war, charges which I think have a lot of foundation about the uh, deportation of children, um, and the Russification of children, which is a war crime. I'd say it's been a conventional war in which civilians have generally not been targeted. And if you just look, there are famous 20th century statistics about how many more civilians begin to die in war, but way more combatants have died in on both sides in the Ukraine-Russia war than civilians. And so that suggests that I'm not, you know, singing anyone's praises here, but it's a war in which limits are being accepted in some sense. Okay, so that's a different, I think, situation than I was concerned about. It's true that that war is endless. Donald Trump, ironically, is doing a lot to try to bring some kind of peace. It may be an unjust peace. Um, but I don't think there's a very good claim to make that concern about like how brutal the war is has extended the war. I mean, it's just not a good case. If we turn to the Middle East and Israel's Gaza war, I think that is, you know, the plot thickens because there I would say that the overwhelming concern about the war has been whether it has been fought cleanly enough.
Yeah, yeah,
Israel with IDF, the Israeli Defense Lawyer Forces lawyered up, claims it followed the law. Lawyers help pick targets that were doing what we're supposed to do. The vast majority of world opinion says it's an atrocity or worse, a genocide. And so, there I think it's the war is a very good candidate for thinking in my framework because in my view, what's gotten lost, at least for a very long time, um, is, well, wait, why is this war happening? What would be the conditions for peace? Do we want to Israel to fight the war cleanly and endlessly, as it's in a sense been doing against the Palestinian people for decades in a kind of endless occupation, and in the case of Gaza, repeated wars, what they call mowing the lawn. And if our critique is that it's not being done, in a way that spares civilians enough, I worry that will play into this kind of syndrome of endlessness. So those are the two big wars that have been happening, and that's how I think they fit or don't fit my framework. There's one thing I, think it is worth concluding on for this answer, which is that I made a big deal of how Barack Obama claimed that his war on terror wouldn't be George W. Bush's. It wouldn't have the torture. It would minimize civilian casualties. And people believed him. They have not believed Israel when it said it tried to adhere to the law and that it was complying with moral standards. So that's a difference. And so the legitimacy that you can claim by saying we're following the law, the United States may have reaped that legitimacy in some quarters, at least for a while, as the war on terror was made humane. But Israel has not buttressed the legitimacy of its war. It just has been its statements have been rejected.
just on that alone, do you think that a lot of this has to do with the Israeli leadership singling out Benjamin Netanyahu specifically? Would any other Israeli prime minister be in his position as a figure of quite some controversy, even though he's a wartime leader of Israel? Prior to October 7, there was a very real prospect that he would end up in jail because of corruption
Yes.
charges.
Yes.
Then, of course, this happens, and he rebadges himself as a wartime leader. And as a consequence of that, and as a consequence of a lot of public skepticism about his main aim and objective in the Gaza campaign, namely keeping the war going, because if he stops the war, he goes back to the courts, right? Um, there is a skepticism in him, which I suppose any other Israeli prime minister who wasn't haunted by all this other background guff would probably not have the international community look at him and say, no, this is ridiculous. You can't fight a war like that. But because Netanyahu is doing this in Gaza at a time where his reputation is on the line, people are questioning him openly. Yeah.
That's very insightful. And I think it's more plausible as the war dragged on. But remember, for months and months, not just the Israeli populace, including Netanyahu's bitterest enemies, backed his agenda, but the United States did, and in
Yeah.
fact, many Western European countries and many countries otherwise that are kind of have favored uh, Israel's policy almost in a kind of carte blanche way. And so it was only after a very, very long time that that Netanyahu's uh, ulterior motives throughout uh, looked more suspicious. Now, I
Mm.
would say there's another explanation, which is goes with yours, that they can both be true, which is that Israel said the law and being law abiding looks different when you're facing an organization in urban warfare that is human shielding, that is living amidst the populace, that is placing weapons underneath hospitals and schools. And so it turns out that what might have seemed like within the boundaries of humane warfare in these very specific circumstances of urban counterinsurgency just are intolerable for some big audience that didn't find that when the drones were striking rural Pakistan or
Mm.
Waziristan. Uh, and, I think the visibility, including on social media, of this war was much higher internationally. Um, and it just the concentration of it. And of course, what some have called the kind of, I think it's like urbanicide, really the leveling
Yeah.
of Gaza has been so just breathtaking that if that's what staying true to the law means, then maybe the law isn't great. Now, ironically, even though I think that's a strong explanation for why the humane effect didn't work in the same way, the war's bitterest critics invoke the law and they say this is genocide, not this is wrong or this is imperialism or injustice. I mean, sometimes they say those things, but they thought they could gain traction precisely by appealing to legal categories, and they did to some extent. I just would worry that it might not, in the end, lead to where they want, which is a political settlement.
Yeah.
And so that's the debate we would have to get into. And I don't have absolutely, you know, absolute conviction about what the right answer is, but that's the kind of debate that's worth having.
Yes. Sam, one of the things that strikes me odd when we're talking about, the law, war, morality, and justice, and the way that the Israelis chose to fight against Iran and its proxies, there is a very clear distinction between Gaza and, of course, the way that, the long-range surgical strikes took place over Iran against Iran's nuclear program, and obviously even Hezbollah, because the operation that the pages and the walkie-talkies blew up in
Yes.
various
Yes.
Hezbollah pockets and whatnot. I mean, it was a way of disabling an enemy in a
Yes.
very clever way. Why did the Israelis choose not to be as clever? I understand that um, Gaza was a very urban center, and you're very right in saying that, Hamas combatants used hospitals as cover. They've used, they just used civilian infrastructure as cover for their movements. But in the end, was there not a better way for the IDF to conduct itself in Gaza, which wouldn't have led to the flattening of much of the urban infrastructure? And that would have obviously had a very big impact on the way that the world saw that campaign, because now it doesn't look
Yes.
like an Israel Hamas campaign. It looks like an
Yes.
Israel Palestine campaign. And that's a different level of hurt for Israel because now its
Yes.
reputation
Yes.
has been trashed.
Yes. Well, I think that's largely right. I mean, I still would, you know, I don't know if you'll agree with this, but there seem to me like big distinctions between the different theaters of war in which Israel was fighting.
Mm,
And in Lebanon and especially in Iran, it could strike leaders with some confidence of where they were. And, the pager operation, a lot of people worried that it was indiscriminate and it probably did kill some of the wrong people.
mm,
But all things considered, it was way more discriminate than what happened in Gaza.
yeah.
And I totally agree with you that that's evidence for the fact that the real war aim in Gaza was the punishment of a people and, if you like, revenge.
Mm,
Um, and uh, and yet, I think it's just the case that it it was hard to find the leaders of Hamas, and the if you really went out and said we're going to assume that all males of a certain age are part of the organization and they're just strewn throughout the city and we don't know where the leaders are, and your declared war aim is to eliminate this group, there's I don't see a big alternative to what they did. Now, I think the war aim was wrong because that price is too high, even if in other circumstances like Lebanon or Iran, it might be a legitimate war aim. Um, and the very fact that it's caused such revulsion through the huge collateral cost suggests that a lot of people think that at a certain point, your legitimate war aim becomes illegitimate um, because of the circumstances of the fighting that it requires. Now, that's being very friendly to Israel. There is going to be, an International Court of Justice ruling about whether it in fact committed genocide, and that's going to involve an intricate weighing of, politician statements, looking at the way in which they were and weren't relevant to the formulation of actual policy. I think, it's hard to deny based on just what we see with the naked eye that there was more involved in the strategy and tactics of the war against Hamas than just getting Hamas, because there was just too much death and destruction for that to account for it. That said, it's just really hard to fight a precise war in as an urban counterinsurgent situation.
mm. Um, I'm just curious, what's your opinion of Israel subjecting itself to a post-war international criminal court kind of situation? I mean, I'm a skeptic about this. I mean, I even in a post-Netanyahu setting, I don't think that Israel would volunteer itself to hand over members of the IDF or any such thing. I think that that's just beyond the pale.
Of course not, and Americans have never done so either,
Right, right.
but back
But that,
decades, and
yeah.
so yeah, I totally agree with you.
Mm. But does this not undermine the very fabric of this international order we're meant to be supporting? I mean, going back to Ukraine, for instance, the Western militaries are always touting the adherence to the laws of war, but then you've got a combatant like Russia that shows very little restraint. And so, in such an asymmetric conflict, doesn't the idea of having a humane war framework become kind of meaningless, or at least, at worst, from at least one perspective, a self-imposed handicap? If one were to obey these international norms and conditions, you're basically making your militaries fight wars with their hands tied behind their back. At least that would be an argument, right?
Sure. No, and that was always the classic argument. I mean, I've suggested earlier that I kind of think compared to Israel, Russia was very restrained in Ukraine. I mean, it really did, for the most part, and especially as the war went on, restrict its attacks to military targets. And Ukraine certainly did, with some exceptions. And so that became a conventional war of position in part because there were these battle lines and there were, soldiers and tanks at it. And that's very familiar to us. And those are the circumstances with the civilian population just gone, in which it's actually possible to like discriminate between combatant and civilian, radically unlike Gaza. Of course, like right now, some Ukrainians are fleeing from the Russian army, which is, it has its eyes set on a town 6 miles from the front, and that part of the front has been basically stable, and now it's not anymore because Russia's been advancing generally, and so this could change, but I basically agree with you. Of course, that it was always the proposition um, that we can rely on the military to engage in self-restraint, and there were those actors. I talk about them in Humane in the 19th century, like Karl von Clausewitz and many others, who said no, actually, it's better to have short wars which are more brutal, which will then make them shorter, and the overall brutality will be less. And that argument didn't win the day. What won the day was the expectation of some restraint. And, you know, of of course we can argue like how credible is that? Does it ever happen? I think it does. And there are some examples of that in recent history. I guess I'd say you know, on the accountability front, I'm not optimistic like you, especially when it comes to powerful states or their allies, clients, whatever. Especially if their leaders aren't willing to travel, are willing not to travel. Um, and we've seen very good examples of Netanyahu actually traveling and having even signatories to the Rome Statute not make a move to arrest him. Others have welcomed him with open arms. I think it was never the premise of like we could hope for militaries to engage in self-restraint without believing that there will be a massive revolution in which wrongdoers are hauled into court somewhere.
Mm, mm,
Actually, most of the most powerful armies are pretty immune to prosecution, always were, probably always will be. And so yeah, accountability is something that might be, a modest hope that we shouldn't, get too grandiose about. And I just don't think it, as you say, it's made much progress. But the aspiration to control, to get militaries to control themselves, regardless of they'd ever get punished if they didn't, I think that aspiration has gotten very far, even when accountability hasn't.
mm. Sam, in the lead up to the Trump-Putin Alaska summit, could one say that while Western precision weaponry is prolonging Ukraine's resistance, it's the less humane reality of Russian attritional war and civilian terror bombing which may force a settlement to Putin's favor? What do you think is that we will be seeing come Friday?
I have no idea. I hope against hope that, Donald Trump surprises us and actually does aim for a relatively more just peace. Um, it's not going to be just because it looks like he understands, and I think he's right about this, that we're in a circumstance where peace will require, you know, giving some stuff to Russia that they really shouldn't get, like
Yeah.
some land. Um, that said, such a deal may be preferable, all things considered, to endless war. I don't think that the humanity or inhumanity of the war is driving anyone. I think it's that the West, including Europeans, seem unwilling and unable to stave off the Russian advance, and it's just inexorable. And Russia has very good reasons to end the war. Um, I don't think it can hold out for either um, really kind of a client state in Ukraine of the kind it once enjoyed before the Maidan uprisings, and I don't think that I mean, from my perspective, Putin is in a lovely position to to declare a ceasefire and take home some winnings, as unpalatable as that is. And so I don't think it's the fact that like he can terrorize Ukraine that's driving things. I think it's the fact that he's winning and Trump understands that, you know, it's past time for a deal. And the real question is, what is the nature of that, and can the sides agree in the West side case to hold their nose and give Putin a little of what he wants?
This is actually suggesting something quite well, disturbing, I will say. It's almost presuming that there won't be any pushback to whatever takes place in Alaska, that the two
Yes,
leaders of the United States and Russia get together. They're going to get a
of
piece of
course.
paper. They'll be carving up the map of Ukraine, saying this is going here, that's going there. And yet Ukraine has no say. The European
Oh,
Union will be sidelined and therefore embarrassed,
yes,
or will there be some pushback that is being hatched in the halls of power in Brussels? Do you see that Europe will take it, won't take another offense and may actually use any bilateral horse trading between Putin and Trump as an excuse for it to continue funneling weapons into Ukraine
right.
and giving succor to Zelensky in the hope that perhaps they can make the price of entry into further eastern parts of Ukraine
Yes.
so problematic for Russia that maybe the balance can be tipped for a better outcome for Ukraine? I don't know.
No one knows, honestly, who lacks the information. And I think that describes both of us. So I'm really speculating. I
Yeah,
did see a story shortly before coming on that the Europeans believe they're in agreement with Trump about at least initial bargaining positions.
yeah.
I think, moreover, I'd say this whole saga has revealed that Europe remains almost in a vassalage relation to the United States. And I think its leaders understand that. There has been a lot of talk about independent foreign policy, its own militarization, replacing a withdrawing America as a Ukraine supporter, but they just don't have the money or weaponry. Maybe they don't have the will. And so my sense is that they are waiting to see if Trump gives away the store, as we would say, to Putin, or really holds his feet to the fire and demands a compromise that looks, you know, reasonable under the circumstances. It's like some version of injustice that is tolerable. And if it is, they will go along, that they will let Trump continue to represent the West, because I don't believe Europeans can displace even declining American power or withdrawing American power. And so it's very sad for Ukraine, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's a function of being where it is, and being in a situation in which the West is unwilling to back it, even as Putin considers it part of his security envelope against that West.
Okay. Taking a lot of what you said earlier, do you think that if a deal is if a bilateral deal between Putin and Trump comes to fruition, that really does then jeopardize other parts of Europe to Russian aggression, potential Russian aggression? If Putin can get away with his war in Ukraine with territory that, he illegitimately claimed, and then it becomes, well, okay, that's yours now. Will
Yes.
that not give Putin succor in terms of, oh, look, well, that wasn't too bad. Okay, I lost a truckload of soldiers, but the
Yeah.
sacrifice was worth it in the end. Let's go after other areas of Europe that we can salami slice away from the West.
So John, I wrote a recent piece that's a book review in the Harper's Magazine that sort of touches on some of this. It's about the origins of the Ukraine war. And I don't want to take a very strong position because I'm not an expert, and I really, I just th I think a lot depends on your priors, like what you think led to this situation. And, my own view inclines to the belief that, well, there has to be a rational kernel somewhere there. Putin set Russia back. Russia is a second-rate power. I mean, it's a power compared to a lot of other states in virtue of its land and resources. It's basically a big gas station uh, in decline, and
With
and
nuclear
yet
weapons.
with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So all true. And yet it emerges weaker economically, militarily than before the war.
Yeah.
Uh, it was it ever credible that it was going to invade anywhere else? Well, maybe Belarus if it were lost to the West. It's certainly true that a lot of East Europeans think it's an aggressive power, and that explains NATO accession through the 90s and 2000s. It explains, Finnish accession recently, and so there's something that is really important there. But my own view is that this was a failed war for Putin. If his war aim was a client state in the east to his west, which I think was what pretty clearly what he wanted, not annexation beyond Crimea and maybe those eastern provinces, then he he doesn't get what he wants. He sets his country back. Inflation, deaths of untold numbers of young Russian uh, kids. And so I don't know. I'm not a believer in the, Putin as Hitler
Yeah.
analogy,
No.
but remember, to go back to your last question, a lot of people have believed that there's only one solution to this conflict, which is beating Putin, maybe ousting Putin.
Mm.
And um, you know, they're going to protest if there's a peace. You're absolutely right about that. Maybe Europeans won't, but a lot of the intelligentsia will,
Mm.
because they frame this as a situation of appeasement and the only alternative being a kind of rolling back the aggression, if
Mm.
not regime change in Russia. And so they're going to be unhappy if there's a peace, but maybe they will learn that all Putin wanted was to be able to save face in his own failing war. And the unjust peace will be unjust, but it might be the best available alternative we have right now.
And actually, it's funny that you should say this because I also share your characterization as Putin not being Hitler. I mean, the Russian army certainly isn't the Wehrmacht. All right, so let's look at the idea of humane war, or whether or not the idea is more of a rhetorical cover under certain circumstances. So Israel insists it takes unprecedented steps to minimize civilian casualties. Yet,
Sure.
the televisuals that are coming out on the destruction and death remain quite significant in the public mind. Does this prove
Yes.
that humane war is more of a rhetorical cover, perhaps a legal artifact, than a
Yes.
reality on the ground?
It's a great question, and I think we never can definitively answer it, because no one could deny that there's a lot of rhetoric in it, self-serving rhetoric that, by states that claim to, engage in this moral hygiene of taking care of the very people they're fighting. And yet I somehow resist the conclusion that it's just rhetoric, because I do think uh, lawyering up has affected the practice of war. And the warrior's honor has changed in great power armies to incorporate the idea that war is not against a nation, but against its leaders and especially its military. Now, in the Gaza case, of course, this position is tested, and it does seem, just rhetoric. But then you think, well, a certain percentage of the Palestinian population has died. The war on in those terms is, probably not worse than some of the worst Cold War fighting in which it was fair game really to kill civilians through aerial bombardment in much more massive numbers, maybe not proportionally, but take the Korean War, even parts of the Vietnam War. Um, you know, Israel's defenders often say no, if they wanted to commit a genocide, why didn't they strike harder, kill more people?
Yep, yep,
Uh, they
yep.
they took care to save some when they could have killed more or all. Now, it's an outrageous claim, but I do think there's something to be said for the proposition that, you know, Israel's conduct has been a kind of, attritional in its own way, killing a lot at the very beginning. That's when most of the civilians were actually killed if they died militarily as opposed to by starvation
Mhm.
nowadays. Um, I think you can make a very strong case that it was kind of like extermination on the installment plan. But that very fact means that Israel had to take care not to do it all at once or through, you know, kind of not just raising the buildings, but intentionally killing as many human beings as possible. And so I don't know. I think it will be a long time before we can look at the conduct of the IDF, what its lawyers were doing and saying. It's certainly the case. We know for sure that the rules of engagement that the IDF, follows, at least for the most part, were changed, were made much more permissive after October 7th than before October 7th. And so that meant that what humane meant was much more vicious. And yet there was constraint, so I'm the last person who wants to let anyone off the hook here. But I think if we take the easy answer that it's all of this is just rhetoric, then we lose the capacity to compare different wars with each
Yep,
other, to compare
yep.
different states and the way that their policy making process and their war fighting actually works.
Mm, mm. Now, we've talked a lot so far about lawyering up, and I know that the West is very strong in this domain. Do we see any indication of this in other countries, though? Do we see it in Russia? Do we see it that the Chinese have a legal contingent that
Yes.
they're managing behind the scenes? Iran, I mean, we talk about the West as if it's somehow different from everyone else because we're the good guys. We're the ones that obey the rules, or at least try to. And
Yes.
so we have
Yes.
all the mechanisms in place that when the blowtorch of public opinion comes to us, we can whip out the lawyers
Yes.
or have a room of lawyers and say, look, this is how we
Yes.
conduct ourselves. So therefore we're better. How does it work for the other side? How does it work for the Russo-Chinese sort of contingent, the BRICS, if you will?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, I think my own theory is that the reason states fight humane or more humane wars sometimes is because they're compelled to do so by public opinion.
Mhm.
And public opinion change, expectations change. And of course, that's not like happening the same way in all regimes. Um, However, I think it did happen globally. And so I have trouble with those who say, oh, liberal states or democratic states, whatever that currently means, are the ones that might engage in restraint and the rest don't. But that doesn't explain Russian conduct in Ukraine, which I'm not apologizing for, but I believe is often within the boundaries of so-called international humanitarian law. I mean, China, it's hard to say, but for years, Westerners thought we should promote international law so that China is locked into it. And so the expectation was that, in a sense, by setting global standards, even those that might not have set them in the same way are forced to adhere to them. Now, we don't know. Remember, China has not fought any wars other than, you know, on the Indian border from time to time. Those have not been, about massacring civilians like Westerners do that very well. Our clients have done it very well in the Cold War. So, but it's fair. It's totally fair to ask what their wars will be like if and when they start fighting them. Um, I don't have any particular reason to think they will be more brutal than the ones that led to this revolution of concern for civilians. They might be less so. I don't know. I think that it is very important ultimately to say that states are constrained generally by what their domestic populations demand and expect, even in authoritarian regimes. And that means that, you know, the world has changed and ordinary people have very different views about what's acceptable in wars than they did 100 or 200 or 1,000 years ago.
So, in fact, what you're suggesting is that war is in a state of continual evolution, and somehow the evolution toward a more humane outcome is now quickening at this point in time because technology allows us to do certain things that we could not do as far back as 80 years ago during World War II.
Well, that is a big factor. Precision is now technologically available. I'm not someone who believes in technological determinism. So I actually think that, we sought precision out of moral reasons in part. In the old days, we invented napalm because we wanted to kill as many people as painfully as possible, and then we sought new technology. But and I'm not Pollyannish because I think, remember, my whole story is that even as these new expectations for warfare have made inroads, we have had more wars. So
Yes.
people's tolerance of war has changed. After World War II, people wanted the end of war. Now they want humane wars. Is that progress? Not for me. I'd much rather have peace in Gaza than humane occupation or warfare. So, but I do think there has been a change over time in the way warfare is fought because of what people expect out of warfare. And, around the world, people from all sorts of different regimes have expressed their horror, maybe selectively, but whatever, at what's happened in Gaza. And that's very strong evidence for the proposition that there has been a certain kind of moral adjustment uh, to what we think ought to be allowed in fighting enemies.
Okay, Sam. So let's take a step back now. If blockades and occupations are inherently coercive, can any conduct of that sort of warlike action be considered humane with the current levels of technology?
I think so. I distinguish between domination and pain. If someone hurts me, you know, it is a form of domination, but I can also imagine forms of domination that are pain-free. If someone, doesn't kill me but throws me into jail, they could treat me humanely in jail, give me very good food and water and sanitation, and yet I'd be a slave to their will. And I think that's generally what's happened in Gaza is not violence, it's subordination. Now, it's been characterized by repeated outbursts of violence, of the violent forms of subordination, but the the real problem is the denial of freedom and self-determination to a whole bunch of people. So I think it is most important that we say it's scary, but actually you can dominate people less violently, and it's still bad.
Yeah,
It
it's
might
still
be
bad.
better if the only alternative is dominating them violently. Of course, we take the humane version every day of the week. But what if there's an alternative that's beyond domination? Then that's what we should care most about, not whether it whether there's more or less violence, because you can have not violent jails, and that's not good.
No, and I think that it raises an interesting question about, okay, well, so you can have peaceful subservience, but in the end, the human condition won't tolerate that for long.
Yes,
Once you feel
yes,
hemmed
exactly.
in, there's that necessity
Exactly.
that you want to break out of that, whatever it is.
Of
So
course, of course. I mean,
yeah.
and we look back and I mean, I'm the last person who would say that what Hamas did on October 7th was justified or anything like that,
Mm,
but we do look back and, idealize the American revolutionaries and, slave people who engaged in slave uprisings. Even, in the history of my country, outright terrorism against slavery, like John Brown is a
mm,
good case. And there are lots of examples of this around the world. Israel itself comes out of a history in which terrorism was involved, the
yeah,
Stern Gang, and
yeah.
so there we all think that, almost everyone, pacifists aside, think that when push comes to shove, uh, domination breeds violence, sometimes justified violence, and then we're in a debate about, well, when. And so I totally agree with you that um, these things are not just different forms of control, but nonviolent control, supposedly is often like the breeding ground for violent outbursts that then justify violent control and repression, and that's what we're seeing today.
Well, basically, it doesn't justify, but it explains groups like
Yes,
Hamas, right? So
yes,
Hamas comes
yes,
about as a consequence of Israel trying to manage in the most humane way possible, at least in their mindset, the problem of what to do with Gaza. So they mow the
yes,
lawn ever so often. They
yes,
internationally isolate the Palestinian people in that
of course.
section, and then yeah,
I mean, their
the
story would be that they withdrew altogether, but of
well, that's the
course, the
story.
other
Yeah,
view is that
yeah,
they set up an open air prison and so forth.
that's right.
So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's fascinating philosophical talk, but I've got to say, the outcomes, irrespective of how we go, are very disturbing because ultimately, people are going to be people, and it doesn't matter. A gilded cage is still a cage. It may be,
yes,
wonderful in
well, that's
every
right.
other respect, and it can certainly calm people down, but it doesn't calm them down to the point of complete, uh, you know, what's the
Agreed.
word? Lying down and taking it. Yeah,
Well, that's true. I mean, on the other hand, people, accept servitude for potentially generations or millennia. And so obviously there's been a lot of that too, a
yeah,
lot of acceptance passively of injustice. And so the question is how much is actually tolerable, and when do people resist it, and what are the like valid means of doing so?
yeah. So, Sam, after decades of anti-war activism in the 20th century, peace movements today seem marginal and less well organized. Have we kind
Yes.
of normalized war to the point where thinking about the abolition of war is no longer credible?
I think so. That's the main case in my book that we've replaced the aspiration to peace with the aspiration to humanity, and it wasn't a good deal. Um, I think there's some qualification to add to that, which is that often people pursue peace by denouncing the violence of war. And it's certainly true that most of Israel's enemies have been appalled by its conduct straight out, but also understood that making hay of it would sap the international legitimacy from Israel and maybe weaken it to force it to treat Palestinians differently, not just in war, but maybe in a future, peaceful scenario. So I'm not sure that that stratagem always works, and I don't believe it's worked in this case. But maybe it does in some cases. I reflected that in my own book that in the War on Terror, I think a lot of people opposed George W. Bush's torture program in part because it was wrong and illegal, but also in part because they thought it was anti-war politics by other means. You couldn't, be so unpatriotic as to contest the premise of the war on terror in those days of 2000, whatever, 4 or 5. But you could indict the torture of the war on terror, and it was a way of attacking war indirectly or standing up for peace indirectly. And again, I don't think it worked because it set up the Obama presidency, which responded by making the war on terror torture free and endless. So, but with that qualification, we don't I think peace has become like not a credible ideal to a lot of people. And so it's on those who think it ought to be one to make it more like believable and tangible. And so in the case of Israel Palestine, I've been working with a group called A Land for All, which has a website, and it's basically a kind of federalist set of proposals to try to imagine a path beyond the one state, two state dilemma. And the point really for me of my involvement is to say, well, we need to care about the underlying political issues, not just whether the war is humane, but above all, like make uh, creative solutions part of what we spend our time talking about. And I'm not saying this is the right one, but I'm saying people are trying to, have a peace movement which requires imagining peace, not just calling for it.
Okay, Sam, do you think that some wars are morally necessary, and in an international setting that is more morally and ethically ambiguous, does right and wrong still have any real significance?
Well, my goodness. I do think that there are wars that are worth fighting. I think they're few and far between. I haven't seen my country fight one in a while. Maybe Ukraine in some of its phases, although I think in the end, the United States perpetuated that one and missed the best chance for a just peace that was available when Ukraine was much stronger. And before Russia started pushing the lines back. Um, and so always in this question, there's a question about what wars are worth starting and when is it worth stopping them, even when they were just at the start. Um, so I'm conceding that, I'm mostly against wars, anti-war, but not pacifist, but there might be a category of just wars. I think morality changes the world. I mean, my study of history, to me, is about how big idealists, prophets in the old days like Jesus and Muhammad, pacifists in our time, at least before they went away, kind of give people a new account of what's worth striving for in the world, and they do have an effect. The Rise of Humane War is a story about idealism in a certain sense. It's about saying we don't have to accept brutality. I raise questions about that idealism and its effects, but there's no doubt. it's a moral set of purposes. It may be misbegotten or perverse, but I'm not someone who thinks all there is real interest and selfishness, and that morality is a sham. I think, that there's a lot of morality. Sometimes it's ill-founded, sometimes it's not. It's often transformative.
To what degree do you think the various military industrial complexes around the world drive or have driven the evolution of warfare to the point where it's now kind of like a self-sustaining exercise? We go to war, we use drones, we use AI, we use all this kind of stuff, and that's okay because we've made it more humane.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, it just keeps on pump priming the military industrial complex to find more innovative ways in which we can de risk to humans as much as we possibly can, giving a legal out for
Yeah.
people who are against war to begin with, for whatever reason. So, you have this machinery that profits from war. That's not going away anytime soon. And
No.
how does one combat that in the scheme of things? Because that's an irresistible force just there.
It's a brilliant question, and it's really a sobering one. And if I knew the answer, I would not be doing what I'm doing. I would be trying to implement the solution. You've really, I think, addressed the kind of hardcore of the problem, which is in part that it became almost hegemonic, or I don't know, but for states to engage in not just massive defense spending, but in uh, often, using defense spending as a way of Keynesian pump priming and, you know, industrial policy, industrial strategy, and, military forces do command an enormous sway across the world. They provide a lot of ordinary people with a leg up when the economy doesn't in many countries. Um, and so it's not a passing fancy. So I agree with all of that. I'm not understating the challenge. I think I would hope that in the long run of humanity, we can find alternatives to war that kind of address some of the needs it clearly does serve. Um, a lot of it is economic, and maybe it requires changing our economic system. Maybe it requires finding alternative economic, you know, advantage for those who currently profit so much from state expenditure on hardware. But that you've isolated really where the reformers should be going and thinking about what's actually possible and how would it be done.
Yeah. All right. Last couple of questions, if you don't mind. If we go back to Putin and we go back to the
Yes,
whole
yes,
Alaska summit, is it
yes,
possible? Because, you unpacked brilliantly the idea that Russia is not the threat that we think it is. It's a third-rate economy, a second-rate power. It really struggled to fight its war in Ukraine. And that has unleashed a number of pressures now because Russia is a dictatorship and it's opaque. We don't know exactly how damaged Russia is going to come out of this campaign. But
yes,
is there a risk that if Putin gets peace or signs away
yes,
some territory and settles, that
yes,
in the end we get what we want? I mean, that somehow Russia will start peeling away in the post-war period, revealing the vulnerability of Putin politically. I mean, is it possible that
yes.
actually we get rid of the dictator in spite of his so-called
Mm,
settlement of the war, in
mm,
spite of his pro-Russia peace?
of course. Well, of course. So first of all, he's not a young man, so he's not forever. And the same is even more true of Donald Trump. Um, I read a statistic the other day that over half of humanity lives under a political leader over 70 years of age, and once that's largely because Xi Jinping passed 70 a few years ago. Um, but no, I really like your supposition. We don't know the conditions under which there can be regime change anywhere in any
Yeah.
despotism. And I think we were so surprised, really, even so many experts by 1989, and we can now look back. The books I review in the Harper's article I mentioned are kind of about this, that the West really mismanaged the period of the 1990s, helping bring about Vladimir Putin's rise. And so, you know, history is going to continue and he's not going to be there forever. We don't know what will succeed him, if there will be ever anytime soon another chance for a democratic Russia. But if that does materialize, it's not as if, there will just be a victory lap to run, as many took after 1989, but like, a better strategy for keeping Russia within the democratic fold. And that was obviously short-lived. But I don't know. I love your conjecture, which is that it's kind of like adapting your question about Netanyahu, but applying it to Russia. If leaders fight wars to stay in power, well, it follows that the end of those wars leave them more exposed rather than less exposed. And that could happen for Putin. Uh, I think a lot of people would argue that that having the war continue would leave him more exposed. I doubt it. I kind of like your conjecture better. It rings truer, but I'm not sure how plausible either one is.
Okay, Sam, final question. With the proliferation of drones and autonomous weapons, are we heading toward a world where lethal force is so easy to apply and so distant from human risk that even the idea of restraining war becomes obsolete? In other words, will killing become as routine as a keystroke?
I think so. If you, I think there's going to be a lot of work on deterrence of the kind that happened with nuclear weapons in the Cold War. And I think the really frightening scenario involves, of course, artificial intelligence. And if artificial intelligence gets control of uh, you know, the tools of violent death, it could be that it's, these judgments about how to achieve deterrence, whether it's been achieved, whether strikes are warranted, and in cases where, deterrence, your side might lose deterrence. All that is super terrifying. But no, I mean, from what I can tell, we're entering a very scary world in which, as some authors have argued, like Gabriella Bloom and Benjamin Wittes, a further effect will be that the tools of violence become, in a sense, uh, like privatized, and many different forces other than states can possess them, can send them. And so the future is bleak if we don't act soon to control these weapons in the same way that the planet, is warming because we have not acted quickly enough to control our emissions. And I don't think history ends in either case, but it means that we're much worse off for not having acted with alacrity to recognize these threats.
Professor Samuel Moyn, thanks for sharing your insights again on the focus.
Thanks for having me, John.
That's all for this episode of The Focus. My thanks to Professor Samuel Moyn for his insights on how military technology, law, and ethics are reshaping the way wars are fought, and perhaps the way they never end. Whether you believe modern warfare can be made humane or whether that idea only hides its dangers, the question remains, what kind of wars are we willing to live with? My thanks to producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Join us next time as we continue to explore the forces shaping our world. Until then, from Adelaide, South Australia, I'm Dr. John Bruni. Thanks for listening.